Empires are often described as if they collapse through wars, retreating armies, shrinking borders, fallen palaces. Most people believe that is how it happens. But history, in its deeper layers, tells a different story. Empires collapse first in their accounting ledgers. War is merely the last unpaid bill. The collapse of the Qing Dynasty was exactly like this. This is not the story of an empire that fell because it was militarily weak. It is the story of a system that lost its money, saw its trade balance collapse, and whose financial structure dissolved from within. Welcome to Code 404, Economy, where the historical codes of money are revealed. The truth is always hidden in the details. The Qing Empire had effectively gone bankrupt long before its fall, but no one saw this clearly, because from the outside, everything still looked great. The Qing Dynasty was China's last imperial dynasty. It ruled for more than 250 years between the 17th and 20th centuries. At the beginning of the 18th century, China was the largest economy in the world. Its productive capacity was high, its agriculture strong, and its craftsmanship highly advanced. Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain were in especially high demand in Europe. China, on the other hand, needed almost nothing from Europe. As a result, trade functioned in only one direction. China sold goods to Europe and received silver in return. The silver obtained from foreign merchants stimulated the economy. But at the same time, China became dependent on silver imports. This situation did not concern the Qing elites. On the contrary, they saw it as a sign of victory, because the empire had internalized the idea, if the world is pouring silver into us, we are powerful. But this was one of the most expensive illusions in history, and they were not aware of it at the time. The Qing economy was built on silver. The heart of the system beat around silver. Taxes were paid in silver. The imperial budget was calculated in silver, and the central government collected silver from the local administrations. Copper coins existed in daily life, but for the state, real money was silver. At first glance, this appeared to be a solid system, because silver was valuable, reliable, and global. But the state's dependence on silver imports was a major problem. According to Qing officials, the system was working, because silver continued to flow in. But once money replaces production, it ceases to be power. China's population more than doubled throughout the 18th century. The population was exploding. But instead of increasing production, improving efficiency, or updating the tax system, the state chose to rely on silver flowing in from trade. Tax rates remained fixed, and the connection between state revenues and the real economy was severed. The empire was growing, but state revenues were not. At this point, the Qing were still standing. From the outside, they appeared powerful. Palaces still stood. The army looked magnificent. Taxes were still being collected under the existing system. But the system had become vulnerable to even the smallest shock. The severed link between domestic production and the budget meant a loss of control over state revenues. The money supply depended on foreign trade. In other words, the Qing had surrendered their fate to the decisions of the outside world, and that outside world would not accept this situation forever. Europe, especially Britain, tolerated this one-sided trade for a long time. But constantly losing silver was a problem for them, and it was not sustainable. They needed products from China. But they had nothing to sell to China in return. This meant a chronic trade deficit for Britain. They searched for a way to fix it. And the solution was opium. Opium was banned in China. But the ban did not stop demand. Britain produced opium in India and systematically funneled it into the Chinese market. As a result, China was still selling goods, but the silver it earned was being spent on opium. This was no longer a moral issue. It was not a diplomatic issue either. It was the collapse of the monetary system. When silver began to leave China, the first blow was felt in taxation, because the people were required to pay taxes in silver. But silver in the market was steadily declining. As silver became scarcer, its value rose. This meant that even though the nominal tax amount remained the same, it became heavier in real terms. As a result, peasants went into debt, mortgaged their land, and production declined. The state, meanwhile, lost revenue due to uncollected taxes, and the budget deficit grew. Instead of fixing the system, the Qing administration chose to collect the same taxes through harsher methods. This is the reflexive mistake made by every collapsing system. When faced with the silver crisis, the Qing administration theoretically had three options. 1. Reform the tax system. 2. Implement structural transformations to increase production. 3. Suppress the crisis through force. The Qing chose the third, because the first two options required money. And the Qing no longer had money. At this point, the state mindset locked onto one idea. If revenues are falling, collect more aggressively. This is a reflexive decision seen throughout history in collapsing financial systems. But this decision does not solve the crisis. On the contrary, it causes the crisis to grow exponentially. Modern states borrow during crises. They spread budget deficits over time. They pull resources from the future into the present. The Qing could not do this because modern financial instruments did not exist. There was no central bank, no government bond market, no developed institutional credit mechanism. The financial system was local and fragmented. In other words, when revenues declined, the Qing were a state with very limited room to maneuver. This is a critical difference. European states survived military defeats by borrowing. The Qing, by contrast, became unable to generate cash even when they won wars. The Qing fiscal system depended on silver collected by the central government from local officials. But as the crisis deepened, access to silver also declined. Local officials could no longer obtain silver, and the taxes sent to the center decreased. The bureaucracy became unable to finance itself. At this point, corruption also exploded because salaries could no longer be paid. Bribery became widespread. State authority was converted into money. The state, which was supposed to provide order, was turning into an instrument of exploitation. This situation also triggered rebellions. Major rebellions during the Qing period are often described as religious, ethnic, or cultural, but this is only a superficial reading. The real causes underlying the rebellions were lack of access to silver, inability to pay taxes, high food prices, and corruption within the state system. People rebelled because the system had ceased to be livable. The White Lotus Rebellion, the Taiping Rebellion, local uprisings, all of them rose on the same foundation: economic suffocation. The rebellions not only disrupted order, but also consumed the state's last remaining resources. Because taxes could no longer be collected, the army could not be fed, and public order could not be financed. On top of that, military campaigns had to be financed to suppress the rebellions. The army had to be fed. Tax collection had completely broken down. From this point on, collapse became irreversible. The Opium Wars are usually described like this: the Qing fell behind, and the West came and crushed them. This narrative is incomplete, because military defeat is not the cause, but the result. An economically strong state can close technological gaps. A fiscally sound state can implement reforms. A state with money can buy time. That is the reality. The Qing had none of these. Qing officials became aware of their backwardness. Reforms were necessary, but reforms were expensive. Building industry, creating a modern army, reforming education, all required money. The Qing, however, no longer had silver. Their budget was shattered. They had no access to credit. As a result, reforms could not be implemented. Those that were attempted came too late, remained incomplete, and stayed on paper. Modernization failed because it could not be financed. Unequal treaties are often described as humiliation, but their real meaning is this: the Qing had lost their bargaining power. Because they could not finance military resistance. Their economy could not sustain long wars. They had no resources left to buy time. That is why they could not negotiate and lost at the table. This story is not unique. History is full of the Qing story and its equivalents. Empires that debased their currency, became dependent on silver and gold, tried to survive on debt, and concealed inefficiency have always met the same end. The Qing relied on cash flows instead of production. They lost their trade balance. They distorted the balance between income and expenditure. In the end, when the numbers no longer added up in the accounting books, the final bill went unpaid, and the empire collapsed. Empires are believed to be indestructible. But history shows us this: no empire can survive after losing its money. When a state loses its revenues, power turns into an illusion. This is not a Chinese story. This is the story of every system that forgets the relationship between money and power. History speaks in numbers, and the numbers always whisper the same thing. Empires collapse first in the ledgers. And once those ledgers are closed, no army can reopen them. If this video gave you a new perspective, subscribe. The answers are hidden in history's codes. We reveal them.